speak briefly in support of this motion. And I note for those here in the council and those who may pay attention to either the Hansard or the broadcast of this motion does several things. One, it recognises that Julian Assange is an Australian citizen and a journalist with WikiLeaks who aided in exposing possible war crimes and civilian casualties in the release of documents, which of course included Afghanistan war logs in 2010 and Guantanamo Bay files in 2011 that were supplied to WikiLeaks by Chelsea Manning, a former US Army intelligence analyst. It also acknowledges Mr Assange genuinely believed his actions were for the purposes of government accountability, transparency and integrity, and the broader public interest and for the interests of justice. It also notes that since the publication of these documents, he's been forced into isolation or imprisonment over the course of 10 years, and that's resulted in the serious deterioration of his health and his mental well-being. It recognises that Mr Assange's impending prosecution by the United States of America does actually constitute a serious attack on the fundamental democratic freedoms of the press. It questions the legitimacy of prosecuting Mr Assange in the United States through that country's Espionage Act of 1917, carrying a penalty of up to 175 years of imprisonment. And also it questions the legitimacy of whether that act should be applied to non-US citizens living and working in other countries at the time of any alleged offending. Indeed, the legitimacy of an American Espionage Act applying to every other citizen of the globe. Extraordinary. It also calls on the President of the Legislative Council, this place, to write a letter or an email to the President of the United States, now Joe Biden, expressing the Legislative Council, that's us, elected members of the South Australian Parliament, expressing a desire that he, as President, show clemency by intervening in the extradition and prosecution of Mr Assange and instruct the US Attorney General and US Department of Justice to withdraw all charges on medical and humanitarian grounds. It also instructs the President to write to the Prime Minister of Australia, the Right Honourable Anthony Albanese, and the Minister of Foreign Affairs, the Honourable Senator Penny Wong, requesting they write to the President of the United States to express the concerns, as well as also communicating with the US Ambassador, Ms Carolyn Kennedy, to express the concerns of this Legislative Council, should this motion pass, regarding Mr Assange's prosecution. Further, it notes that a poll conducted by the Sydney Morning Herald in January this year showed 71% of people supported Mr Assange being returned to Australia. I start by noting that just last year, the then opposition leader, Anthony Albanese, now Minister, at the time, back just last year, called for Julian Assange's urgent release from jail. He said, and I quote, "He can't see what is served by keeping him incarcerated," end quote. The Greens couldn't agree more. It's sadly he can't agree with his own words with deeds to follow them up once he is in a position to do so. As the director of WikiLeaks, Julian Assange received information from sources and he published that information online. By doing so, he exposed the war crimes of the United States to the world. The crimes here are the war crimes of the United States that were exposed to the world. That's the criminal behaviour. What is not the criminal behaviour is the journalism. If the United States is allowed to pursue charges against Julian Assange, it will have devastating consequences on the freedom of speech and the freedom of press, not just here in Australia, not just in America, but indeed across the globe. We do have a responsibility to do all we can to ensure that that does not happen. It's clear that there is widespread public support for Julian Assange to be returned to Australia. Across the nation, thousands of people continue to organise and rally to bring him home. My Greens colleagues, such as Senator Janet Rice, Senator Peter Whish-Wilson, Senator Jordan Steele-John and Senator David Shoebridge, have all been tireless in their advocacy for Julian Assange in the federal parliament, and I note that previous Senator Scott Ludlam certainly was similarly staunch in his work on this issue and continues to be. Unfortunately, though, now that Mr Albanese is Prime Minister, he seems to have fallen silent. He has claimed that he doesn't wish to exercise megaphone politics. And while I am not averse to holding a megaphone, if that is his imperative, that is fair enough. If that is his style, that is fair enough. But what is not fair enough is for him not even to pick up the phone or to put out a press release once he's Prime Minister to reaffirm the views that the people of Australia voted, thinking he believed and would take from opposition to his role as Prime Minister. He must get on the phone and tell President Joe Biden in no uncertain terms that the US must end this abuse of power and drop the charges against Julian Assange. But so far, we've seen no action. Perhaps there has been some, but we have certainly seen none. And I've got to say, silence has been the great weapon in this now over 10-year debate. In fact, the government's official response now is that they have, quote, noted the extradition order and that they would like to see his case, quote, brought to a close. Well, so will we all. However, with silence, that close does not draw closer, indeed gets further away. The deeply troubling conclusion is that by their intention to bring it to a close, by doing nothing or being silent, indeed that does nothing to prevent the charging, prosecution and potential conviction in a US court of Julian Assange, and as I say, does nothing to prevent him potentially being sentenced for up to 175 years in jail for the crime of telling the truth, of reporting the truth, for the supposed crime of espionage, for reporting on a war crime. I can see who the real criminals here are, and they certainly aren't Julian Assange. Julian has spent the last 3 years in maximum security in Belmarsh prison in the UK, and if he is convicted, he will potentially spend the rest of his life in solitary confinement. All the evidence indicates that his health has deteriorated from these years of arbitrary detention that he has been forced to endure. No less than the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture and other cruel, inhuman and degrading treatment or punishment has concluded that, quote, in addition to physical ailments, Mr Assange showed all symptoms typical for prolonged exposure to psychological torture, including extreme stress, chronic anxiety and intense psychological trauma, end quote. And that was also, I've got to say, obviously picked up by the UK magistrate most recently in the High Court, who accepted the expert testimony that if his extradition to the US were to become imminent, he would have the urge to take his own life. Julian Assange cannot be left to die because our leaders think that it's politically expedient to allow our so-called allies to exact revenge on a journalist who exposed their war crimes. It is as simple as that. We must intervene immediately and decisively to end this injustice. Writing a few letters or emails seems the least that we could do as the elected representatives of the people of this state. As WikiLeaks wrote in their statement responding to the extradition news, Julian Assange's freedom is coupled to all of our freedoms. The Greens will always support a journalist's right to speak truth to power. We will always continue the fight to bring Julian home. And indeed, I wish a few more people in power were willing to not just speak the truth, but protect the truth.